Fuck, fuck, fuck. How does he know? How does Dave know about this? My marriage is over. I just know it. The courts will find Dave to be the primary caretaker of our children. He will be awarded custody. I will be a social pariah shunned by virtually everyone in this church-going community, forgiven by the priest with soft words, but with a judgmental look on his face, just as he did with Mary Skelton. She only lasted about 3 months or so after her husband found out about her affair, 3 lonely months, when the rest of the community shunned her, even though the priest forgave her. This community really hates cheating spouses. I slammed on the brakes and screeched to a halt, stopping 2 meters away from colliding with a little girl who ran out into the road chasing a ball. She looked to be about 3, about the same age as my Paula. I was driving too fast, too absorbed in my enormous problem. The kid's mother scowled at me from the sidewalk, even though it was her fucking fault for not watching her kid. I looked around and saw that I was near a large park, 5 minutes from home. I suppressed my fears, drove with shaky hands another 200 meters and stopped before hitting someone absent-mindedly. How could Dave even think? No, it's stupid. Once Dave found out I was having an affair, it makes sense that he thought poorly of me and wanted to cover his bases. He may run a small newsroom from home, but that doesn't mean he's stupid. Far from it. As soon as he found out, of course, he thought it wasn't my first case and started doing DNA tests on the kids. But how the hell did he know? And Carl and I had been so careful. Thoughts reminded me of Carl. I picked up my phone and moved on to Carla, if Dave ever asked, a recently started coworker. My motto was to stay as close to the truth as possible. My message, can you talk? As I waited for an answer, I kept kicking myself. Why did I let this smooth-talking little asshole seduce me? No, come on, be honest, it's not fair. The way we slept together the first time wasn't seduction and is completely understandable. It happened when we were out of town. We had just spent 2 whole days negotiating an exhausting deal, celebrated with too much champagne, and fell into bed together. If I had settled on the first case, everything would have been fine. I would have had a secret that I would have regretted until my last day. A serious secret that could only hurt my husband and family. But or should I say we, alas. We were both gripped by the excitement of sleeping with someone after more than 10 years of marriage. The allure of the illegality of it all, the thrill of the naughtiness. The excellence of realizing that we had cheated on our spouses and successfully hid it from 2 people who knew us so well, or not successfully hiding it, as it turns out. My musings were interrupted by a text from Carl. No, having dinner with Mary and the kids. What's the matter? Well, they say misery loves company. He knows, Dave knows about us. How the hell did Dave find out about this? We were incredibly discreet, only got together when we were away, and that was only if we managed to get adjoining rooms. We never walked through the door of the same room together, always used condoms, even the first time. We behaved completely normally, both in public and when we were at home with our spouses. Zing, damn, Mary is acting normal, so he didn't say anything to her. Do you think he will? How angry is he? I don't know. We haven't talked yet. I ran away as soon as I found out he knew. This time I didn't have to wait long for an answer. Please beg him not to tell Mary. Selfish little prick. Screw my marriage while it's none of his business. Asshole. I'll probably tell his wife if Dave doesn't. Like I said, misery loves company. So how did we get discovered? I made sure my love for my husband wasn't compromised, didn't introduce any new positions or techniques I learned from Carl. Fucking chance. Sex with Carl was vanilla and uninspiring. It was smaller, held for less time, and nowhere near as varied as my Dave. In fact, if it hadn't been for the illegality of it all, it wouldn't have lasted the 6 times over the 7 months we'd actually had it. How unlucky that we were discovered before I was about to end our affair after our next trip in 2 weeks. Damn it, damn it. Focus, Megan. How we were discovered is irrelevant. We were exposed, and now my husband trusts me so little that he's doing DNA tests on our children. My mind went back 20 minutes to when I got home late, too late to enjoy dinner with my family. Thankfully, Dave worked from home, took the kids to school, and cooked dinner 6 nights a week. I was supposed to cook on Sundays, but I usually went out and got takeout. Let's just say cooking is not one of my strengths. As I walked through the door, I froze at the horrifying sight. Dave is sitting on one of the kitchen chairs with a cotton swab on a stick, wiping the inside of Jillian's, our 5-year-old daughter's, mouth with it. An open sterilized bag lies on the table. Peter, our 7-year-old son, was also standing there, either waiting his turn or already finished. I had read enough stories and watched enough TV shows to know that I was watching the opening act of a DNA test. My initial reaction was rage. How dare Dave think the kids weren't his? I wasn't a whore, or was I? Knowing I needed to think about how best to get over it, I just turned and ran. Just before I did, Dave turned to look at me with a neutral expression. I brought my hands to my cheeks, remembering the sensation of the blood rushing off them, which was a blatant admission of the truth of what the testing had accused me of. 20 minutes later, here I am, reflecting on the destruction of my family and my community. I knew Dave. I knew him as well as he knew himself. As soon as he was ready to confront me, he did so firmly and calmly. He wouldn't want the whole town to know he'd been hornswoggled. If I can't stop him from divorcing me, I'll ask him to do it quietly just to say we're estranged. That way, even if I lose my marriage, I can still stay in town and see my kids, perhaps sharing joint custody. I really do love them. My mind wandered for God knows how long, running through different scenarios of how Dave would react, trying to find the scenario that would allow me to lose the least. Suddenly, I realized that I was reasoning like a defeatist. I'm using my knowledge of Dave and assuming that a breakup would go without saying, and the best scenario would be a quiet divorce. But what if I'm wrong? What if I put myself at Dave's mercy? I tell him about the forgivable first time and the regrettable sequel. He doesn't want a divorce any more than I do. Sure, his faith in me will be shaken, and it will take years for him to fully trust me again. But I'll still have the respectability and support of the community. If you do this, Megan, you'll have to be completely honest with Dave. One whiff of a lie, and you'll get to the curb faster than a fast-footed cheetah. I glanced at my watch. Just under 2 hours had passed since I discovered that I hadn't been as clever at hiding my affair with Carl as I'd thought. 2 hours since I'd gone from being confident in my marriage to fighting for his very life. 2 hours since I'd seen my husband testing my children's DNA had raised my blood pressure 100 points. I quickly typed a message. I'm on my way home to apologize to you for my affair with Carl. Please don't do anything rash. Then slowly headed home in my car. Epilogue of Megan. Well, what happened after that surpassed my worst nightmare. 10 minutes after sending my text message, I made it home. As soon as I pulled into the driveway, Dave jumped out the door, tossed me, "Stay here and watch the kids," and sped off in his car, screaming. I found out later that he headed straight for Carl's house, and when my lover opened the door, broke his nose in one blow, screaming, "You're sleeping with my wife, aren't you?" Those words stopped Carl's wife calling the police. And together with Dave, they learned the whole story as Carl begged them to call him an ambulance. Since Carl said he had been hit and his wife claimed he had hit the wall himself, the police investigation went nowhere. By the time he returned from the hospital, the locks on his house had been changed, and his wife had made an online appointment with a divorce attorney. How do I know all this? Dave came straight home, told me to pack a bag and leave. Taking one look at the fire in his eyes and the bruises on his knuckles, guessing where they came from, I did as he asked and fled to a mid-range motel. The next day, I saw a bandaged Carl at the bar at breakfast. All hopes that Dave would be quiet came crashing down early in the afternoon when Carl and I were invited into the chief operating officer's office and summarily executed. She didn't cite any morals because our contracts simply stated that she shouldn't hire scumbags like us. Oops. I realized what the immediate future would be like when I called all 3 divorce attorneys in our town, but no one returned my call. When I went to the diner for dinner, the waitress refused to acknowledge my existence. The nail in the coffin lid, however, was when I met with Carl and learned that family, friends, and former coworkers already treated him like a leper. Within 2 days, spurred on by a visit from the motel manager who stated that his establishment was fully booked, yeah, right, Carl and I accepted the inevitable and left town. We didn't wanna become social ghosts, which we saw Mary Skelton become last year when she was caught cheating. We drove 300 kilometers and started a new life together. It didn't last long. I know I'm probably stating the damn obvious, but when 2 cheaters get together, there is no trust. Stupid. I never realized how important trust is in a relationship until tonight when I had to fight the urge to check his phone while he was in the bathroom. By the time I finally worked up the courage to ask Dave if I could go back into town to visit the kids over the weekend, they had all found a replacement for me. He was perfect prey, and once he was on the loose, the vultures, being attractive singles and widows, declared their interest. By the time I cleaned myself up, there was already a nifty set of shoes under Dave's bed. My kids had a half-sister, and they were already calling the other woman mom. Now that I'm too old to start another family, all I can do is sit and ponder the lonely life ahead of me. Epilogue of Dave. I lie here glancing at the bedside clock, 11:05 p.m. The soft breathing of Ruth lying next to me reminds me of our sexual marathon of the last 2 hours. Damn, sex with someone new after 10 years with the same woman was good. Damn good. We did some things that were borderline inappropriate. Yeah, life is good, but it's a little weird. My wife cheated on me, but before I could mourn the demise of that marriage too much, I was seduced by a younger, prettier, and sexually more adventurous one. The surreal last day of my old marriage still confuses the hell out of me. Maybe if I digest it in my head for the 10,000th time, it will finally make sense. How'd it go? On the last day of my marriage, Megan came running home, and without saying a word, just turned around and left again. I heard her car start and drive away. I was busy for a few more minutes, and by the time I called Megan's cell phone, it was busy. Finding no sign of her presence, I started putting the kids to bed, and they were fast asleep. Unfortunately, the fact that they didn't see their mother before they went to bed was not unusual. I went into the kitchen and was just about to call Megan again when the house phone rang. An unrecognized cell phone number popped up on the display. The next few minutes from memory went something like this. Hi, this is David Brown speaking. Hi, Dave, it's Carl. I knew Carl, of course. He started working with my wife a while back. I had seen him at several work events and was even invited to his housewarming party. What was his wife's name? Rebecca Beck, something like that. Very handsome, well-built, and a couple years younger than Megan and me. Carl, on the other hand, seemed like a bore. Arrogant, smug, he looked down on me. A legend in his own mind. The last person I'd want to talk to after a hard day, which is why my next words probably didn't sound very friendly. Yeah, Carl, what can I do for you? What would it take? I had no idea what he was talking about, and in confusion I remained silent, forcing him to continue. If my wife finds out I've been having an affair with Megan for the last 6 months or so, she'll cut my balls off and I'll lose my kids. So I'll be honest, Dave, what does it take to keep your mouth shut? I don't remember dropping my phone and collapsing to the floor as the crushing news that my loving wife had betrayed me in the worst possible way hit my consciousness. I had suspected nothing and could not believe it. Yet the pleading in Carl's voice was quite compelling. My mind then turned to a recently frequently discussed problem. Why had my wife seemed to have become emotionally distant from me and the kids over the past 6 months or so? Nothing drastic, just definitely something there. I later realized that the first stage of grief, denial, lasted less than 30 minutes. That stage was followed by anger. I was filled with a blind rage that masked the pain of my loss. I still had enough self-control not to snap at Megan. That led to prison. Her lover, however, was a completely different person. As soon as I heard Megan was back, I drove to the asshole's house, and with all the anger I had, punched him. The feeling of bones and cartilage breaking under my fist made me smile even now. Carl's forced confession while his blood dripped was completely unnecessary for me, but necessary for his wife. Releasing my anger allowed me to go home and calmly tell Megan to fuck off. Listening to my woman's light snoring in bed, I realized I was no closer to solving the mystery than the last 100 times I'd thought about it. Why had Carl himself sown the seeds of the destruction of his own marriage by confessing to me when I was completely unsuspecting? Once again, I couldn't escape the thought that Megan's strange behavior that night when she'd come home from work and immediately run off without saying a word had something to do with all of this. I replayed that night in my head once more. I made dinner as I always did. Megan confirmed she would be late, so we sat and ate with the kids, chatting as usual. Then it started to clear up. Jillian complained that a spot in her mouth hurt. I grabbed a flashlight, turned her bottom lip down, and saw an ulcer. Walking over to our first aid cabinet, I grabbed a tube of Boniella and one of the individually wrapped cotton swabs, opened, applied, and used the cream as directed. Absolutely nothing to do with the mystery at hand. Heck, I was beginning to suspect I'd never find out. Turning onto my side, I slid my arm under the sleeping beauty's head and cuddled her, kissing the back of her neck gently. She snuggled against me and purred lightly. To hell with the mystery. This story is called My Wife of 9 Years Cheated with 2 Men at Her Friend's Bachelorette Party. It was my wife's best friend's bachelorette party. They had planned a weekend at a cabin and my wife was really excited to go. I trusted her and didn't think anything of it. The night before she left, she came into our bedroom while I was getting ready for bed. She sat on the bed next to me, and I could tell she had something on her mind. She said to me, "Thank you for letting me go. I just want to go and have fun and support my friend who is getting married in a few weeks." I said, "Of course, have a great time." She then leaned in to kiss me, and we went to bed. The next morning, she left early with her friends. I didn't hear from her much over the weekend, which wasn't unusual, but we did text each other a lot. On Sunday night, she sent me a text saying that she was on her way home and would be home in a few hours. When she got home, she looked like she had a good time and she was very happy. The next day, I went to work and my wife went to her friend's house to help her get ready for the wedding. Over the next few weeks, my wife was helping her friend prepare for her wedding. She would leave work and go to her friend's house for a few hours, a couple of days a week. Then one day while I was at work, I overheard some coworkers saying something about a video surfacing about what went on at this bachelorette party at this cabin. I asked what they were talking about, and they said that apparently this video shows a woman getting banged by 2 men. At this point, I didn't know who the woman was. Over the next couple of days, I started hearing more people talk about this video and I was sort of curious. So, after work one day, my wife wasn't home yet. So, I started digging around on the computer, going to different websites to see if I could find this video people were talking about, but I couldn't find anything. My wife came home a few hours later and I asked her about the video. She had a confused look on her face. She didn't know anything about a video. So, I laughed it off and said, I wonder what went on at that cabin. I couldn't see my wife's face. The next day I went to work, and as soon as I sat down at my desk, one of my coworkers said, Hey, have you seen that video? I told him I hadn't been able to find it. He pulled out his phone and started showing me the video. It was the same video that people had been talking about. I was in complete shock. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It shows four half-naked men walking into the cabin with all the women in the background cheering. And then the men started going around one by one, dancing in front of all the women. I am still laughing because I assumed that's all that went on. But then the video keeps going, and it shows one of the men getting really close to this woman who happened to be my wife. My whole demeanor changed. I was no longer laughing. She starts touching him. And then another man comes up behind her and he starts touching her as well. It gets worse. One man picks my wife up over his shoulder and takes her in this room. And the other man follows. My mouth hit the floor. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Eventually, both men come out of the room with my wife following behind them. She has a big smile on her face, and she's completely naked. The video ends there. And I just sat there in shock. I didn't know what to do, but I gathered my composure. I then asked my coworker, can he send me the video? Which he did. I wasn't going to tell my wife what I just saw. I am angry, devastated. She cheated with these two strange men without a hitch, like it was nothing and I didn't matter. So, the rest of the day at work, I was a zombie. I couldn't even think straight, but I finally got a hold of myself and made some phone calls. I called a friend of mine who's a lawyer and I asked him what I should do. He told me to take my time and think about what I want to do. But he also said if it were him, he would go ahead and file for divorce. After the brief conversation with my friend, I called a divorce lawyer to find out what I could do based on my wife cheating and what she was entitled to. I told him we had no kids, but we own the house that we have a mortgage on, and we both have jobs. He told me if I wanted to stay in the house, I could file for divorce and try to get my wife out of the house, but it would be a long battle and I may not win. So, after talking with two different lawyers, I made my decision. I was going to divorce my wife. I would file for divorce the next day. There wasn't a damn thing she could say to me why she did that to me. And I'm thinking she doesn't even know about the video. That night, I couldn't even sleep. I was so upset. I just kept thinking about that video and how my wife could do something like that to me. The next morning, I woke up early around 6 a.m. I couldn't go back to sleep. So, I got out of bed, got dressed, and went to work. My wife was still asleep. I didn't even say anything to her. For those of you who are wondering, we haven't been intimate and I haven't initiated anything with my wife since that video. When I got to work, I told my boss I needed to take some time off. He could tell something was wrong, but he didn't ask any questions. I then went home while my wife was at work. I began to pack some of her clothes and other things, and I packed up a couple of suitcases and put them by the door. When I was finished, I waited until about 11:30 in the morning or so. I pulled out my phone, found the link to the video, and sent it to my wife. It showed that she read it right away. When I saw that, I immediately FaceTimed her and told her I wanted a divorce. I already filed and she needs to come get her stuff. She hung up on me, and then she called me back about 5 minutes later and told me she was on her way home. I told her when she gets here, I will be upstairs in my office and I don't want to see her face. When she gets home, she is crying and bawling, asking where in the hell did I get this video. I told her, I am not telling you that, you just need to leave. She then says, I am not going anywhere. This is my house too. She then says, we are married. You can't just kick me out. I told her we won't be married for long. She gets on her phone and calls her best friend, crying and telling her friend that I am trying to kick her out of the house. And I have this video of her. Her best friend then tells her she needs to come over to her house and she will call a lawyer for her. So, my wife hangs up the phone, grabs a couple of suitcases, and leaves. Then her best friend calls me and asks why am I trying to kick her out of the house? I promptly send my wife's best friend the link. I assumed that my wife had shown her, but apparently not. After my wife's best friend saw the video, she told me she would be contacting a lawyer for my wife and that I needed to leave my wife alone. I told my wife's friend, this is between my wife and me, not you. And for your information, I have already filed for divorce. As the days go by, my wife is texting me, calling me, pleading, and leaving voicemails. I didn't respond at all. I then get a call from my wife's lawyer. He asks, do I have a lawyer? I promptly gave him that information. He said, thank you, and hung up the phone. A few days later, I received paperwork from my wife's lawyer. It was divorce paperwork. I read through the paperwork and faxed it to my lawyer. I also emailed my lawyer, letting him know that I received the paperwork. A few days after that, I get a call from my lawyer and I ask him, what is my soon-to-be ex-wife asking for? He then proceeds to tell me she is asking for half of everything, the house and one car. He said, surprisingly, she is not asking for alimony. I told him her father is wealthy. He owns 4 hotels and a bunch of other businesses. So, I am pretty sure she will be just fine. I then told my lawyer, I want her out of the house and I want her name off of everything. He said that is going to be a little difficult, but he will see what he can do. A few weeks later, I am at work and I get a call from my lawyer, and he said he had some bad news. He said, since her name is on the deed, you can't just kick her out. And since she wants half of the house, you probably will have to sell it. I told him, I don't want to sell the house. I love that house. It was our first home together. He then said, the choice is yours, but if you don't sell the house, you will have to go to court and fight for it. So, I told my attorney, I plan to fight for the house and I don't want to sell it. A few weeks later, I am served with divorce papers and a court date is set. I show up to court, and so does my wife. We both have our lawyers with us. The judge asks my wife what she wants. And she says half of everything, the house and one car. The judge then looks at me and asks my lawyer, what does his client want? My attorney says he wants a divorce, and he wants her out of the house, and her name off of everything. The judge looks at both lawyers and then looks at us. And he asks us if there is anything we can agree on. My wife and I look at each other and we both shake our heads. No. The judge then says here in Alabama, which is a no-fault state, can be fault-based as well. And adultery is one of those faults. The judge, who is a woman, looks at my wife and says, young lady, you have committed adultery and I am going to grant your husband a divorce on the grounds of adultery. The judge then looks at my wife and says, ma'am, I am ordering you to move out of the house within 30 days, but you have a mortgage together. I can't do anything about that. You have to work that out with your mortgage lender. He then says, sir, she can move back into the house. If she wants, it's the marital home and she has a right to it. But if she does move back in, she has 30 days to move back out. The judge then looks at me and says, I am ordering you to pay the mortgage until it is paid off or sold. The judge asks if there is anything else. And her lawyer says that my wife wants one of the cars. The judge looks at me and says, is that true? I then tell the judge, yes, she can have one of the cars, but she has to pay for it herself. The judge says she can have the car. After that, the judge grants the divorce. About a week later, after the divorce, my ex-wife sends me a text saying she will not be moving back in. She just wants her part of the equity in the home, and she will sign the house over to me. I text her back and I tell her the only equity we have is $30,000 and I told her I would give her half of that once I refinanced. Once I refinanced and all the other legal stuff was taken care of. I gave her half of the small equity we had in the home. A few months later, My wife's father dies and she inherits $3 million. Yeah, she didn't need anything from me. Even if her father didn't pass away, she would have still been okay. Her father would have looked after her, and I will not take her back just because she inherited millions and she has tried. She has called and texted, but I have not responded and I will not. I know a lot of responses were take her back because of the money, but I didn't want to touch her. I didn't think of her the same. To this day, her best friend and my ex-wife still doesn't know who recorded the video at the cabin that weekend. Well, after all that drama, I am a free man. I was surprised at the responses I got on this site, but I guess these forums can be helpful. Thank you all for your awesome support. As a man in his 40s, I am absolutely grateful that I did not have any kids with this woman. If you enjoyed the story, please like, comment, and consider subscribing to the channel for more content. My marriage with Melanie came to an end after just 3 years. I've fallen in love with someone else. Let's break up. Until then, I had been completely oblivious to her affair. Indeed, our conversations had dwindled recently. She often came home late, claiming overtime, and on weekends she found reasons to be away from home. I thought maybe that was just how marriage settles down after 3 years. I never imagined her heart had drifted so far from me. I put up with this countryside for 3 years. You should be grateful. You are all about your job, just job, and never interested in me. She said with a displeased look. Whether I try to discuss, deny, or apologize, her decision to divorce didn't change. Eventually, I signed the divorce papers as she demanded. Within a few days, Melanie packed her belongings and left with her new lover to her parents' home out of state. After she left, I stayed alone in the same house. My life became a cycle of work and home. The days just passed. The town where I was assigned after we got married is a quaint countryside area. Not heavily populated, the relationships with the locals were close-knit. Melanie never seemed to enjoy the rural life, and she didn't make close friends after we moved here. Yet, our divorce spread quickly, and I became known as the man who was dumped by his wife. People, both from the neighborhood and my workplace, looked at me with pity. Some directly asked, "That must have been tough. Are you okay?" Or inquisitively, "Is it true your wife ran off with another man?" Honestly, the divorce hit me hard. I felt a gaping hole in my chest and longed to talk to someone, but in this small town, everything spreads fast. I didn't want that, so I kept to myself. To avoid sinking into despair, I threw myself into work even more than before. It seems my workaholic nature partly caused the loneliness Melanie felt. I had mistakenly thought that being diligent at work would make her happy. Now, all I had was my job. I was engrossed in my work, tuning out even the concerns of those around me. Then, about 6 months later, a new colleague joined our company. Her name was Susan Jackson, transferred from our New York headquarters. According to my boss, she is 36, 3 years my senior. She is with top sales performance at the headquarters and touted as a future department head. She was assigned to our branch for a year to boost its performance. With her understated yet tasteful makeup, she dressed in elegant suits, exuded the aura of sophisticated city woman. From day one, she efficiently reviewed our work, identifying current issues and future objectives. She was all business, with clear, concise instructions. She worked silently and diligently, efficiently completing her tasks one after another without any idle chatter. She was the epitome of a capable woman, which was incredibly cool. Yet, when asking for our help, she'd say, "Excuse me, do you have a moment?" with a humble, gentle smile. Despite her competence, she wasn't unapproachable, and everyone at the branch was charmed by the contrast. Everyone admired and wanted to talk to her. She always finished her work on time, leaving with a cheerful, "Good job, everyone," and swiftly headed home. The female coworkers wondered. She always leaves so quickly. Maybe she has a boyfriend waiting at home. Is she married? There was a buzz of curiosity about her, but nobody seemed to get close to her. Seeing her, I envied her ability to live life so smoothly. Since Susan came from the city, no one here knows her past. I'd like to live without people knowing my past, not worrying about others' opinions. I've started to think that, in this town, everything becomes known quickly. I had resigned myself to that fact because it's a small town, but seeing Susan's behavior, I've started to wonder if moving to a city like hers would clear up my worries. Also, I thought about joining the headquarters to improve my skills, inspired by someone as high caliber as her. So, I seriously started discussing a transfer to our New York headquarters with my boss. Then one day, a welcome party for Susan was planned. We all left work on time and headed to a nearby bar. That day, Susan didn't rush home at her usual time, but joined us for dinner. As the party started, everyone eagerly bombarded her with questions. What kind of work did she do at the headquarters? When did she become the top salesperson? What's her secret? She answered each question meticulously. After a while, the questions shifted to her personal life. Was she married? Did she have a boyfriend? Just as she was about to answer these more personal questions, her phone rang. Excuse me for a moment. She stepped outside to take the call. The questioning paused and the room fell silent. Then, a drunk coworker, Edward, started pestering me. Is it true your wife cheated on you? Suddenly, all eyes were on me. It's over and done with. I tried to deflect, but the inebriated coworker relentlessly prodded. Did you get any compensation? Did you hire a lawyer? No one else intervened, seemingly curious themselves. I didn't want to remember any of it. Frustration built up in me, and I was about to snap. Then, sorry for stepping out. I'm back now, Susan announced with a smile, sitting down between Edward and me. Then she resumed with a smile. We were in the middle of questions, weren't we? And began talking about her personal life. She revealed she was divorced. She had a daughter at 20, now in high school. She got pregnant while in college, took a break to have her daughter, and divorced at 30 due to her ex-husband's infidelity. She shared all that. My daughter lives with my parents in New York. That call was from her. Ended with sweetly smile. She then lightened the mood with more cheerful topics, and neither my story nor hers came up again. I was relieved and deeply grateful to her. Her strength in openly discussing her situation also struck a chord with me. The next day, I caught up with her as she was leaving work on time. Susan, I really appreciated what you did last night. Thank you. I called out to her. She stopped and turned with her usual graceful smile. I should be thanking you for the wonderful welcome party. She responded with her usual graceful and gentle smile, but sensing my feelings weren't fully conveyed, I anxiously continued speaking. No, I mean, you heard the questions I was getting from Edward, right? Stepping in and diverting the attention from me really helped. I find it really tough to talk in detail about my divorce, I said, scratching my head awkwardly, and she nodded understandingly. I get it. It's hard to put into words when the divorce is still fresh. The pain is normal. As she answered, gently gazing distantly, I asked hesitantly, because of me, everyone ended up learning about your past. Are you okay with that? I was concerned she might have reluctantly taken my place, not wanting to share her own story. I was really worried that she had put herself out there as a substitute for me. Sensing my inner turmoil, she showed an even gentler smile, as if understanding my concerns. Time has healed my wounds. You'll be okay, too. Time resolves these things. She reassured me. She waved. See you tomorrow. Lightly, and walked away, leaving me feeling almost dreamy as I watched her go. From then on, we began to chat during breaks at work and sometimes after work. Susan talked to her daughter every day at 6 p.m., explaining why she never stayed late. Sharing her secret made me feel a ticklish sense of camaraderie. She spent her weekends in New York with her daughter. My daughter, Catherine, loves baking. She's always made something for me to try when I visit. It's something I really look forward to, Susan would say with a tender, almost melting smile, and watching her became a daily highlight for me. Eager to talk more with her, I started working more efficiently to leave work on time, just like her. Until 6 p.m., when she would call her daughter, we'd chat outside the office. To ensure our time together, I worked harder and harder. But that wasn't like right after my divorce, when I was trying to forget something. Making an effort to create time to talk with Susan, even when tired, felt somehow gratifying and pleasant. It was a bitterly cold Friday in February. By then, our post-work chats had become a daily routine. With the onset of colder weather, we had taken to talking in a cafe after work instead of outside. It was almost 6 p.m. Once the time passed, we would have 2 days off starting tomorrow. We wouldn't see each other for 2 days as she usually went to New York every weekend. I want to talk more. I want to spend more time with her. Unable to contain my feelings, I blurted out, I wish I could go with you tomorrow. Savi? She looked surprised realizing what I'd said. I covered my mouth, but it was too late. Seeing my flustered and red face, she chuckled softly. Sure, you can come. I'd like you to meet my daughter too. Shocked yet elated at her consent, I mentally did a victory dance. The next day, Susan and I boarded the plane together, heading to her hometown in New York. Although I'd been there a few times, its bustling crowd always overwhelmed me, and I was incredibly nervous. Her daughter and parents were at her house. I wondered if it was okay for a guy like me to just show up. I just hoped not to leave a bad impression. Nervously, I entered her house. Her daughter, looking a lot like her, and her kind-looking parents warmly welcomed me. I was ushered into the living room and exchanged greetings with everyone. We've heard how kind you've been to Susan since her transfer. Thank you. Her parents said with their appreciation. Flustered, I talked about the town where we worked and her accomplishments at the company. Time flew by, and it was almost time for my flight back. Although Susan was supposed to stay overnight, she kindly took me to the airport with her daughter. As we neared the departure gate, her daughter Catherine silently handed me a paper bag. Oh, thank you. Is this for me? She looked up shyly and whispered. I heard it's almost your birthday, so I made you some chocolates. I'm good at making sweets. Thank you for making my mom happy. Hearing that, Susan turned red to the ears and panicked, who is usually composed. You made this just for me? Yes. I wanted to give chocolates to my mom's favorite person. Catherine replied playfully, dodging Susan's attempt to cover her mouth and sticking out her tongue. Their interaction was heartwarming, and I felt incredibly happy. Thank you. Receiving chocolates from the daughter of someone I like makes me the luckiest man. I replied sincerely, a bit shyly, and Catherine covered her face with her hands, squealing. Wow. Susan and I exchanged smiles, both blushing at her cute reaction. The following Monday of that weekend, I followed Susan after work as usual. Thanks for Saturday. The chocolates were delicious. Turning to my voice, Susan appeared a bit bashful, and she pulled a neatly wrapped small package from her bag. Do you know what day it is today? I nodded enthusiastically, taking the package carefully. Of course, I knew. It was my actual birthday, and I'd been restless all day. Thank you. I'm so happy. Can I join you at your parents' place again? She looked at me seriously. Be prepared, it's going to be tough. My parents and Catherine seem to like you. They said to bring you again. I bet they'll want you every week. Her smile betraying her embarrassment, and I felt enveloped in happiness again. Just today, my boss hinted that my request to transfer to New York might soon be granted. My recent hard work had been recognized. Susan's assignment here would end in a few months. If my transfer goes through, it would surely bring us closer. Even if it doesn't, I plan to visit her family every weekend by plane, and if needed, I'm willing to change jobs. When my ex-wife Melanie told me that I wasn't interested in her, I didn't quite understand, but meeting Susan, I believe for the first time I truly learned to love someone. While I don't regret divorcing her, I've reflected a lot. I'm determined to build a happy home with Susan, the precious person I've finally found. No matter how hard it is, the thought of this effort fills me with an invigorating. Deborah, are you okay? Do you feel bad? Asked the maid Mary to the hotel manager. It was not customary for her to be familiar with her superiors, but the manager was really scary to look at. Deborah was incredibly pale, her always perfect hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red with tears. It was clear that she was holding on, but Mary's sincere sympathy made her chin quiver, and her eyes filled with tears. Mary wanted to bring water, but the manager stopped her. Let's go to my office, Deborah whispered with difficulty, holding back her sobs and lowering her head, headed swiftly to her office. Mary followed Deborah, who immediately threw herself on the leather sofa and began to sob. Mary closed the door tightly and sat down next to her, compassionately stroking Deborah on her arm. She did not ask questions, knowing that the woman needed first to cry and then to speak. After a while, Deborah calmed down a little and told Mary about her misfortune. As it turned out, her husband, after 10 years of marriage, cheated on her with a young girl. Who needs me now? I'm already 35 years old, said Deborah through her sobs. Oh, I thought you were only a couple of years older than me, gasped Mary, who was only 21. Deborah really did look great and was always proud of it. Mary, you're certainly pretty, but you need to take care of your figure at your age. Is it good to walk around with such a big belly? Said the manager with a condemning look. But I'm 5 months pregnant, timidly murmured Mary. When she came to work at the hotel 3 months ago, she had to hide the fact of her pregnancy. She strongly needed this job because her fiancé was recently fired from the taxi company for his rude attitude to the client, and he could not find a job anywhere. And now Mary decided to tell her boss the truth, because soon her condition would be obvious. Hearing the news, Deborah began to cry even harder. It turned out that adultery was not the only reason for separation from her husband. Years ago, she interrupted a pregnancy at her husband's insistence, and when they finally got back on their feet and her husband wanted a son, she was no longer able to give birth to him. After a few minutes, Deborah finally managed to pull herself together, and she asked Mary to return to her work duties. The young woman headed for the door, but suddenly the manager called out to her again. Mary, didn't you ask me recently to get your boyfriend a job? Yes, Paul is a very good driver. You won't regret it. Right, but he was fired from the cab company for a reason. Deborah looked at Mary questioningly, and she lowered her eyes in a blush. Okay, let him come in tomorrow. I'll talk to him, and maybe we'll take him, but on probation. Mary rejoiced and began to thank Deborah, but she had already stared into some papers and made it clear that the conversation was over. The next day, Paul, immaculately shaven, wearing pants and shirt perfectly ironed by Mary, stood at the entrance of the hotel. This was the chance he could not miss. Now the main thing was to make Deborah like him and pass the probationary period. The interview was quick, and Paul got the job. How successfully her fiancé was working, Mary discovered only a couple of months later when she got to the maternity hospital. She repeatedly tried to call Paul to tell him about his daughter's birth, but the phone was silent from her shift worker who came to see her. Mary heard that the day before, Paul had driven away Deborah with a suitcase and no one else had seen them. Mary did not know what to think. She cried all day long, calling hospitals and morgues, but all to no avail. Mary was waiting to be discharged so she could write to the police about her fiancé's disappearance. But when she came home with the child, she saw a miserable scrap of paper on the bed in their rented apartment. It was a note from Paul. Placing her newborn daughter on the bed, Mary started reading. Paul briefly informed her that he was leaving her for Deborah and that they were going on vacation together. At the end of it was a postscript. The apartment is paid for to the end of the month, then pay yourself, or you can go to your aunt's in the village, since your boss don't want to see you working in a hotel anymore. And as we are not married, I do not owe you anything. Mary threw herself on the bed and wept in pain, resentment, and disappointment. She realized that the fate of many young girls who got pregnant before marriage, who believed their boyfriend's stories, had caught up with her. First, they had no time to get married, then they had no money, then Paul had problems with his job, and now she had to go back to the village alone with the baby to her aunt and listen to her reproaches and lectures. But she had to go back, since there was no other way out. At the threshold of her aunt's house, Mary stopped in indecision. Aunt Helen was a strict and unkind woman, and Mary was afraid of her reaction. But suddenly the door swung open. "Well, come in, don't be afraid," said Helen, quite friendly and smiling, took the baby out of Mary's hands. "How did you name your daughter?" "Victoria," Mary whispered. "Victoria means winning. It's a great name, not like yours. I never could understand why your mother named you that." Mary sighed, listening to the familiar grumbling of her aunt. She was the older sister of Mary's deceased father, and she would have been grandmother to her niece by age. Helen, noticing the gloomy expression on the girl's face, stumped. "Okay, darling, I am not going to ask questions now, so don't worry. We need to take care of the baby, and first of all to feed her." Mary cried and told her aunt that she could not feed her daughter because she had lost her milk. Helen gasped and realized that her niece had a serious problem in the city. When the baby girl was bathed, changed her clothes, and fed with formula, she fell asleep, and Helen thought about what they should do next. The woman said that an old rich woman lived in their village. The locals did not like her, and she, due to her contentious character, did not let anyone near her and seldom communicated with anyone except Helen. In recent years, Mrs. Carter became quite sick and could not go to the store or cook her own food, so Helen helped her as much as she could. But now the situation had changed. It had become difficult for Helen to help Mrs. Carter because of her age, so she suggested that Mary get a job at Mrs. Carter's house as a helper. Mary was in dire need of money and work, but she still had doubts since she had a little baby in her arms. "Don't worry, I'll take care of Victoria," assured Mary's aunt. "This is your own home, and you and I are the family." There was so much tenderness and warmth in her voice that Mary simply could not believe her ears. And for the first time in her life, Helen told her niece about her hard fate, about her 3 miscarriages in her youth, about how her husband had left her for someone else, and how she had suffered. And Mary finally understood much of what was incomprehensible to her in her aunt's behavior when she was a teenager. "And don't be afraid of Mrs. Carter. She only looks so formidable. But in fact, she's an unhappy elderly woman," said Helen. And in great secret, she told her niece the Mrs. Carter's sad story. It was all about her daughter Caroline. The girl had been in love with a poor guy Tom since high school, and Mrs. Carter was against it and forbade them to date. When the guy was drafted into the army, Mrs. Carter arranged with the local mailman and intercepted the lovers' letters to each other. Tom, thinking that Caroline had forgotten about him, stopped writing to her and returned from the army already with his bride. Mrs. Carter was pleased. Her plan had succeeded. And on the day of Tom's wedding, Mrs. Carter went to a neighboring town to visit relatives, and her daughter left home alone, took sleeping pills. When Mrs. Carter returned home the next morning, the girl was already dead. Since then, Mrs. Carter lives alone in her enormous home with her wealth. But does she need it since she destroyed her own daughter with her own hands? Mary listened to the story and promised her aunt that she would try to be patient with Mrs. Carter and not let her down. Until this moment, Mary thought that she was alone in this world, and it turned out that she had the best aunt. Everything was going great now. She would have a job, and her daughter would have a wonderful nanny ready to give her all her unspent love. The next day, Helen went to see Mrs. Carter. They talked for a long time, and at first, the woman grumbled and didn't even want to hear anything. But then, with difficulty, she agreed. At heart, Mrs. Carter knew that except Helen, she has no one to rely on, so grumbled more out of habit. The first time it was not easy for Mary with grumpy Mrs. Carter. The young woman often got home late at night and fell on her bed without energy. And it was not easy for Helen at first to cope with little Victoria. But as time went on, things gradually got better. The only room to which Mary was forbidden to enter was on the second floor, and only Mrs. Carter had the key. She did not explain the reason, and Mary tried to pretend that she was not interested. But the reason was simple. Caroline had died in this room. She had died of unhappy love and her mother's cruelty. Then, on that fateful day, Mrs. Carter had locked the girl in her room, fearing that she would go to her ex-fiancé's wedding and do something stupid. Could she have thought then that her daughter had already made up her mind, and that sleeping pills had already been prepared in her bedside table to forget herself and fall asleep forever? But there was nothing Mrs. Carter could change now. Watching Mary, she often bitterly thought that if she had not been so cruel to her daughter, then today it would be her granddaughter helping her, not Mary. 3 years had passed, little Victoria was growing up, and Mary was still caring for the elderly woman. But now more out of the call of her heart than out of duty, because they became very attached to each other. Mrs. Carter began to sick more and more often. In the evenings, she usually sat near the fireplace, which was burning in any weather, both in winter and in summer. But one day she called Mary to help her up to the second floor. It was the first time in all the years that Mary had been working there. So the girl was very surprised at such a request and readily helped Mrs. Carter. The elderly woman moved slowly, resting on each step. Finally, when she reached the locked door, she leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, and stood like that for a while, swallowing her tears. Then she held out the key to Mary. "Open it and don't ask me anything." Mary nodded and opened the door. Mrs. Carter gestured for her to stay outside and disappeared into the darkness of the room. The girl stood for a long time, listening to the sounds. Concerned, she did call out to the elderly woman. "Go away," came Mrs. Carter's muffled voice. Mary realized that the woman needed to be alone with her bitter memories and quietly went downstairs. But time passed, night fell, and Mary became anxious again. She worried about how Mrs. Carter could sit there for so long in the cold room. And finally she decided to see if she was all right. She went upstairs and called out to her again, but this time there was no answer. Mary thought that Mrs. Carter had fallen asleep, and opening the door, she went into the room. The elderly woman was really asleep in an armchair by the window, clutching her daughter's toy, a fluffy rabbit. On her lap, there was a box with Caroline's belongings. Mary looked closely at the woman again and suddenly felt that for a sleeping person, she clutched the toy too tightly. To her horror, she realized that Mrs. Carter was dead. After the funeral, Helen and Mary were surprised to find out that the woman had made a will a year ago for the only close people to her, her helpers. It was an unexpected gift for Mary and Helen. Apparently, it was Mrs. Carter's way of thanking them for their care and kindness. Another 5 years passed. One day, the hotel receptionist knocked on the door of the hostess's office. "Mary, excuse me, there's a new driver here. Are you interviewing him yourself, or should I take care of this?" "Invite him in. I'll talk to him myself," replied the hotel owner. After a couple of minutes, a man entered the office. Mary looked up and saw Paul in front of her, but he did not immediately recognize his former girlfriend in such an elegant, beautiful woman. He remembered her as a frightened, anxious girl with a huge belly, which he had accompanied to the maternity hospital. Then, breathing a sigh of relief, he went straight to Deborah, with whom he could finally spend a whole night, and he did not think at all about how his fiancée would be giving birth to their daughter in pain and crying with resentment into the pillow when the other women in the hospital would be visited by their husbands. The only problem was that the fairy tale ended quickly for him. Deborah got fed up with him after 6 months, and she quickly found a replacement. And now, this bald, unemployed loser, with no wife and children, stood before Mary and could not believe his eyes. He shifted his gaze to the desk and saw a nice framed picture. There was a handsome man hugging Mary in a white wedding dress, and a beautiful blonde girl of about 7 stood beside her. "Mary, darling, is that really you?" was all Paul could say. "I am not your darling, and I don't have a job for you," said Mary coldly. "Natalia, call security. Tell them to escort this man outside." Mary stood at the window and smiled as she watched a stunned Paul leaving the hotel. She was mentally thanking him for leaving her then, because his betrayal had turned out in such a happy end for her. Narrated